The next panel, I'm going to be your moderator. It's titled The Impact of COVID-19 on Employee Engagement. And there should be a subtitle, The Impact of COVID-19 on Employee Engagement and the Role of Resilience. Because I tell you, we have two real gurus in the area of resilience. I'm going to let them do self-introductions, but I just have to make a comment on each one. Especially and transparency also, I know this character, Dr. Richard Citron, very well, so I'll be gentle with my comments. But Debra, I appreciate you so much for jumping in here. I know you're between meetings out in Colorado, so I just have to say that I find your background so interesting. You have this MD, your doctor of family practice from UPMC, and you have a BFA from CMU in drama. I mean, maybe that's why you're asked Dr. G, a TV personality, but I'm really looking forward to this. And then you have another character, Dr. Richard Citron. Mental health is really hot right now, as everybody knows. Richard was doing mental health back in the 80s, had a company, got rid of that. Now he's truly like a Dave Mawhinney, an entrepreneur, traditional entrepreneur and a corporate entrepreneur, and he helps a lot of corporate entrepreneurs. So I'm really, really looking forward to this. So why don't I start with Debra, do a little bit more background, throw it over to Richard, a little bit more background, and I'll throw out the first question. Debra?
Terrific. Thank you, Lou. You wouldn't be the first person, including every one of my medical school interviews, who said, drama, really? But like everyone, I think, who's been a student at Carnegie Mellon University, what you learn is that you learn to learn. And it was an incredible experience. I did work in that field for about 6 years before I decided I wanted to be a doctor next. And what has happened since then is that as a physician at a federally qualified health center, after the first few years, when I really had my feet under me, I started to see that there was this gap between helping people be better and actually helping them achieve wellness, a personal sense of well-being. And I looked at the medical literature, and we call that gap resilience. And I said, cool, but what is that? And that set me off on a journey that brought me actually to a lab that I'm working with at Tepper, and people all over the world understanding and talking about how do we learn resilience so that we can help ourselves and so that we can help other people that we work with to navigate change.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Citron?
Hey, Lou, thank you. Deborah, it's great to be on with you as always. I'm an organizational and consulting psychologist. I should clarify, Lou, I didn't get rid of that business. I sold that business. So just to I don't want to make it sound like I ran away from it. I work with organizations. I was thinking about this before we got started. I know this is a session on entrepreneurship, but I want to say that I work with organizations and leaders to help people think inside the box. I think we're always trying to think outside the box. And one of the things that I've learned in my work in resilience, and I've been studying this for over 25 years, as has Deborah, is that there are tremendous resources that we have individually and within our organizations. And sometimes we're always looking outside of ourselves for the answers. And the answer is oftentimes inside ourselves and inside the organizations. We need to dig deeper, find those strengths, find those resources to not just persevere, but to grow from them as well, so that we can really address the challenges that we've had. And that's really my, at the core of my work on resilience and working with organizations is really the focus, is that we build from our strengths. I think we need to do more about that. And I want to say that unlike Jody, there's nothing I could have done about my hair to make it look any better. So it's just the way.
We're going to have to trust Leah also.
We'll have to trust Leah as well.
One thing, Richard, in your background, before I throw out the first question to you talk about Nebraska, and I think Clifton, your experiences there. I mean, I think that's interesting how long you've followed that strength finder.
Yeah, so when I went to graduate school in psychology, I raised the question to myself, why do we always focus on abnormal psychology and what's wrong with people? I was obviously doing it in a very naive and almost ignorant kind of framework. And at the same time, at the University of Nebraska, where I did my graduate work, Don Clifton, who's the father of strengths, a founder of positive psychology and the developer of the Clifton Strength Finders, was in the psychology department at Nebraska doing that work on a much more serious and research-driven basis. The work was so powerful that actually his small consulting firm, which I believe was called Selection Research, began to develop enough capital, both intellectually and financially, to acquire the Gallup organization, which was a much larger and more renowned organization. And of course, under Don's work and his son's work, Gallup has now become a global force, not just around strengths, but also around our topic for today, which is engagement, which really Gallup was the first organization that put together engagement surveys 10 or 15 years ago to look at this theme of how do we, and the way I think about engagement is that engagement at its simplest level is an employee's use of discretionary energy. So, I was commenting to a friend the other day, we were watching football, and these football players they receive a pass, it's a first down, and they get all excited about making that first down. And I'm thinking, dude, this is your job to catch the football. Don't get so excited about it. That's not discretionary energy. Discretionary energy is going along the sidelines, cheering up your teammates, talking to the coach, giving observations about what you're seeing. Catching a football is what you get paid $16 million for. So just do your job, and then let's get more engagement from you by giving more.
Speaking of engagement, Deborah, let me come back over to you. When you think about engagement, how's COVID impacted your practice and your customers?
So my work as a physician is in a federally qualified health center, and we've been certainly really impacted. We closed for a little while, and as a doctor, I did almost entirely house calls for those first few months of the pandemic and work in the hospital. And so we've had to pay a special attention to burnout in the last 6 months, because really the first 6 months, brutal as it was, really fired people towards their calling. And Richard, I think you'd probably agree that one of the things that engages people is the intrinsic motivation of aiming towards your mission. If you aligned yourself even reasonably well when you took a position with the mission of your organization, if you said, yeah, these, not just this paycheck, but this work is for me, then when you are under stress, to excel at that work, and everybody is talking about, and in New York City, banging pots and pans to thank you for doing that work, your engagement may not be the problem. Engagement comes with more time. And the thing that I'm seeing the most that I'd like to speak about, Lou, is actually with the companies that I work with as a resilience expert. The work that what I'm seeing happen there is that people would like to stay engaged. This is my job and I would like to feel good about doing it. But burnout itself has 3 criteria, according to the World Health Organization in their occupational medicine field. They say it is fatigue from the work, feeling exhausted by the work. It is a disengagement, which is, I think, Richard, what you're getting at, that if you're catching the football because you're being paid to do that, but when you're on the bench, you're not in it in your head, you're not using that discretionary energy, and that your efficacy drops. How good you are at the work is not how it was. You actually have a drop from your own personal baseline. And that's why, to be blunt, we have to care about what happens on the bench. We have to care about that discretionary energy, because you could see an employer that might say, I'm burned out. I'm talking about burnout, do your job or don't. But the truth is that even when people are showing up to do their job, if they're not feeling it and putting in that discretionary energy, even the work they're paid to do, that they have to do, the boxes they will check, they won't do it as well.
Thank you. Richard, how's it impacted your practice? Or let me make a little sidebar comment. I'm sorry. I want the audience to know that both of these speakers, as you can tell already, are very prolific. If you look at their LinkedIn backgrounds, they've written several books, so there's a lot more behind this. And I would encourage you to look what they've been doing, especially during the pandemic. Richard, the reason I thought about that is I know your practice, you did so much during the pandemic to reach out to people, a lot more publications. How did that really rock your business?
Well, I think first of all, we have to make the qualifier that this is not the case of how did it happen during the pandemic. We have to look at this as an ongoing process. So what I would say is early on in the pandemic, people did very well. Engagement scores went up among a number of organizations where we conducted culture engagement surveys with my colleague, Michael Couch. We saw an increase in engagement and participation with people, particularly working from home. As we settled in, things worked pretty well. Then when we started having the Delta variant and the vaccines, we began to see a bit more challenge. We had another round of our kids going to have to stay home from school. We've started to see a dip in engagement scores in the last 5 or 6 months. I think the real question is, how do we think about our ability to be resilient going into 2022 and what I think of as kind of the long tail of COVID? Because people, resilience is based on having certain storage of resources and strengths for ourselves. And that's been worn down over the course of this two-year ordeal we've been through. So I think there's some really shifting sands about how we think about resilience and what I'm seeing in organizations. And what I'm seeing right now is a lot of challenge because we're about to go through another change experience, which is this unmasking. We're not going to have to wear a mask soon. Vaccine mandates in many organizations, return to work. I was thinking today if Debra, among your patients, if you'd have told them 2 years ago that their company was going to let them take 2 days off to work at home, they probably would have been ecstatic about that arrangement. Now people are saying, what, only 2 days? How could that possibly be? So again, another change, and change is a very critical aspect of resilience because control is one of the three core factors around strength and resilience among commitment, having a sense of commitment, and also challenge, having a sense of seeing a challenge. But among these, I think control is most important. When people lose that, it becomes more difficult. So kind of an ongoing process, Lou, not so much of what we've seen, as much as what we're seeing and what we think we're going to be seeing going forward.
Richard, I think to your point, we know that most business leaders measure resilience by their employees' ability to navigate change. That's what business leaders care about. We may each as individuals, HR folks might be having a wider definition, but business leaders, when they're asked, they say a resilient employee is one that can navigate change. And there's no end to change. I think a lot of people would like to stop talking about 2020 and 2021. So I think it absolutely makes sense to think about what are the engagement strategies that are going to make a difference in 2022.
Exactly.
Debra, to build off that, when you think, again, in your corporate practice, your customers, what are some of the major pains that the COVID created for them? And Richard, I'm going to ask you the same thing before we think about the positives, but a lot of pain.
Richard named a bunch of them for sure, right? The issue of mask, unmask, where do you work? When do you work? How is your work supervised, and how does it get signed off on? How do you prove your value? Is your value in the number of days, hours per day and days per week you sit in front of your computer? Is it in the productivity? Is it in your willingness to show up when your business is understaffed? One of the places that entrepreneur-led businesses, because not all businesses are entrepreneur-led, but that mindset of being interested in change, seeing the value, seeking out change, trying to stay at the cutting edge of an industry or solving a problem or a mission, one of the real pain points that those folks are experiencing is that the people that work with them are getting distracted from the mission of the company by their own personal sense of purpose. And what I mean by that is our families are having more problems and we are wanting to focus on the work that's on the screen or in front of us, but we also have to educate these kids, like Richard mentioned. When will my kids be back in school? All the time. And their schooling is less certain now because if they have a sniffle or anyone in the house does, everybody has to stay home. So the sands have shifted. Things that we thought were carved in stone, it turns out were barely written in sand. And it is that unpredictability, that uncertainty about Tuesday and 2025 that leave people feeling like there is a hole in the bottom of their resilience bucket, so they have less to give to work and the mission of work.
And one of the things we know about resilience from really the earliest research going back to the 1950s is that the social network is one of the most important factors in a strong, resilient individual and community. And one of the interesting things that we're seeing right now is I'm not sure people know how to connect with each other once they get into the workplace. I'm hearing clients say things like, I don't know why, I go to the office and I sit in my telephone booth and I make calls from my telephone booth.
And some of that is due to something we're seeing in the research called social deconditioning, right? We got a little bit weak. Like if you lay in bed, you lose 2% of your muscle mass for every 24-hour period that you lay completely in bed without getting up. We lost some of our, please forgive the analogy, muscle mass of our ability to connect with other people, and we have other obstacles to connection. Some of them are physical, like you're talking about, Richard. Now, yeah, we don't want you eating in the lunchroom, please, because of the possibility of germ transmission. We want to pod people. You can only take off your mask at your desk. So now people are coming in, working at their desk, eating at their desk, working at their desk, leaving from their desk, and they wave. And some people are put off by the mask thing. Some people are put off by the lack of mask thing. But whatever's happening, there is that issue. There is also the struggle, the friction between people wanting to keep the connections that they built while they were more virtual with their sister-in-law, with their cousin, with their neighbor, and feeling like that is something that they have to, let's be honest, go back to hiding those interactions. Mm-hmm. And there is a lack of transparency about wanting our people to keep up their out of work network or their out of the office network and have the opportunity to call on those folks whenever they need to for a little bit of support or to check in on them because they're worried. So they're distracted, but they're not connecting. Building connections is absolutely one of the key skills in building your own resilience.
Yeah.
And if you're a leader, I hope you heard. Hey, Lou, I was just going to say that if you're a leader, what Dr. G just said is so critical, that you as a leader want to make sure you support your employees in maintaining those connections. I was talking to a client this morning, and he was talking about having made a trip to work with a team in another city from where he lives. He said that he had been doing this project virtually with another business group, and it took 6 months to do it. And with this team he visited, they accomplished it in 3 days. He pointed out that in his organization, they had started cutting back on on-site visits, whether it be the annual sales meeting or professional meetings prior to 2019, which already started, I think, Deborah, to your point, this deconditioning process. And now with COVID, people don't know how to connect. And he said it was so powerful to be with this team for 3 days, to go out to meals together, to share stories, to just have those connections. I know, an area that you're interested in, Lou, is around loneliness. And I think that's one of the themes that we're seeing kind of as a concomitant element of this COVID protocols that we've had to been following, is I think we're all just feeling lonely with our connections. Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to point out that there's not a lot of just to loneliness, because there are clear, loneliness is in and of itself a risk factor for heart disease, a risk factor for several scary, chronic, or terminal medical conditions. So just while we keep highlighting that our brain does not exist separate from our bodies and vice versa, your employees' loneliness matters just as much as the fact that your insurance company gives them a benefit for checking their cholesterol.
Let's do this. We have another 6 or so minutes. Let's flip over to lessons learned, positive things that have come out of this. Richard, let me throw something over to you, because I know that's one of your themes. I've learned from Richard the idea, don't bounce back, bounce forward. Well, what have we learned in bouncing forward, Richard?
Well, Lou, my colleague Michael Couch and I have been running these leadership cafe podcasts for the past year, interviewed over 50 leaders, and we identified from what these leaders had to say 3 key themes that we learned in response to the question, not what has the pandemic done to you, but what has it done for you? The first is culture, that organizations that have a healthy culture, that promote doing right for their employees and customers, do a good job. The example was Faber-Castell, the arts company. They received so many letters of appreciation from parents saying, thank you for your art supplies. It has saved us and our kids. The second area has to do with companies having a great leadership pipeline and encouraging these young leaders to step up and giving them the opportunity in the face of COVID to provide leadership for their team members. And the third area that was an important discovery was, of course, around resilience. And not just about, again, as you alluded to, Lou, not just bouncing back. That's not sufficient. That's not in my mind, resilience. Resilience is really, what have we learned from that experience, and how are we applying it in new and novel situations? And that really, I think, is probably the entrepreneur's lessons, is that you're always trying something new. And that's a lesson that I think can be applied in any organization, is we want to bounce forward.
Excellent. Deborah, what have you seen in your corporate customers?
I think in threes also, so I'll give it to you that same way. The first is, this was a real opportunity for companies to prove their mission, to say, we don't just say that we see our customers as family. We don't just say that we care about the lives of our employees. We now had an opportunity to show what we've been telling for years and years at board meetings and other stakeholder situations. And many companies did. Many companies really stepped up and lived their mission. The second thing that I think is really valuable is that, and I love your phrase, Richard, I will credit you when I use it, thinking inside the box. Many excellent problem solvers were uncovered in this. People who wouldn't necessarily have had the opportunity to show the autonomy and the self-efficacy to figure out how to solve something, be it where to work or how to interact with customers while still keeping them safe, whatever it was. We saw a lot of internal innovation during this time. And companies that are smart enough to not throw that baby out with this really awful COVID-infested bathwater are really seeing some good come out of that. And I would say that the third real silver lining is that we have stopped thinking about mental health as a service we need to provide for any employee who is, God forbid, suicidal. Mm-hmm. Because so many business leaders that I spoke to up through 2019, when I asked about their mental health initiatives, they would say, our employee benefits has a mental health hotline for anyone who's suicidal, box checked. And now a much more nuanced and three-dimensional understanding, not just of mental illness or severe acute mental distress, but of actual mental health has come out of this conversation with initiatives to follow through.
Mental health is completely different than mental illness, and people do not make that distinction. Right. You're watching Debra present is a demonstration of mental health. Going to an arts performance, watching my wife's a dancer, watching my wife dance this weekend, that was mental health. Those are mental health activities.
Well, we have 2 more minutes. Debra, let me give you a minute to open comment or a thought or anything you want to share with the audience. And Richard, I'll give you the last minute.
Okay, Debra? 1 minute. A lot of the most important work that I'm lucky enough to do with business leaders, especially entrepreneurs who thrive on change, is a way to help them understand the reflex that happens in the brain when we're presented with change. And here's an analogy that I often use. I'm a doctor, so I do a lot of well-child checks, and I check a lot of reflexes. So if I stand right in front of your child and check the reflex in their knee, I'm going to get kicked. Whose fault is that? Do we blame the kid or where I stood? Leaders need to understand what happens in the brains of people when we present change so as to not get kicked, which looks like feeling betrayed because this person seems to not like your great idea. If we understand what the reflexes are and how to navigate them, we can help people accept the idea of change and move forward with us a lot more effectively. But I just want to leave you with, don't feel betrayed when the change that you're suggesting is met with resistance. It is a reflex.
Thank you. Richard?
Well, I would build on what Debra said. I started off talking about my approach being a strength-based model. And, Evan from NetSuite, who spoke, was our keynote speaker, kind of mentioned a little bit around empathy and leadership empathy. And what I want to suggest to listeners is that, piggybacking on what Debra said about not expecting to get kicked if you hit the right reflex, is to stop even doing the check for the reflex. Just go into a full observation mode. Physicians are great at observing patients. They're already starting the medical intervention when they see the patient when they first meet or greet her. And so as a leader, pay attention, listen, not even pay attention, just listen to what your employees are saying. There is so much wisdom and understanding that your employees have and can share with you about their role and also about the organization. Empathy is the key skill that I think we're wanting to see in leaders going into 2022 and kind of leading us out of this long tail of COVID, which is listening, paying attention, and just making yourself available to what those your leaders need.
Lou, can I jump in and just say one quick
Yes, you
thing?
can. Yes, you can.
But Richard, I think you'd agree that we put out this message in our society that empathy is easy, and it is not. There are actually 7 cognitive barriers to expressing empathy effectively. So if you say empathy, oh, that makes me feel like a bad person because it's hard for me, you are not a bad person. It is hard for everyone in certain situations.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, when I look at Strength Finders, empathy is my top strength, so it's kind of easy for me. However, you're absolutely right, and taking time to study the elements of empathy is is an important tip. Thanks,
A
Deborah.
great way to wind out the power of EQ. You know, I had very high expectations for this panel, and you blew me away. I wish we had another half hour, but we have another great panel coming up. So I want to thank both of you as we transition to our next panel. And as I mentioned to everybody listening, check out the LinkedIn links for the folks today. Some great material they have available. So thank you both.
Thank you, Lou. It's nice to see you, Richard.
You know.